Now then, this video is about the traditional art of heaving to. I've been wondering how to start it really, because there's so much in it that you can go on talking about heaving to for hours, but I don't want to do that. And I thought, well, I'll start by describing an actual incident where heaving to was the right thing to do for us. And it's a bit of a war story really. It's one of those there I was and the waves were 40 feet high stories. But actually, they very nearly were, because we were engaged in a passage from Beaufort, North Carolina, down to Anguilla, down in the Caribbean. And in those days, we were back in the 1980s here, we hadn't have any long-range forecasts or any big radio or anything like that. We set out from Beaufort with a 24-hour forecast, and that was it really. We were on our own. So away we went, and we were just almost across the Gulf Stream when we got hit by a very, very serious gale. And it was a shocking gale, and we'd very rarely seen anything that bad. And we were faced with an issue. The boat we were in was a 1911 pilot cutter, 35 tons, 51 feet on deck, very heavy displacement, very deep draft, and gaff cutter rigged. She was reasonably sound. She leaked a bit, but she was okay. She was good for it. The question was how to handle the weather. Now, we started off by running before the wind, but the boat was starting to get pretty interesting to steer as she surfed down the waves. And I remembered from years ago when there was only me and my wife Ros sailing a boat, we'd get very tired doing this because you can't really rely on a self-steering gear when it gets to that serious. So in those days we used to heave the boat too, even if we had a fair wind, because once you're hove to, you can kiss your troubles goodbye. You're not going to broach. And the big danger in these situations is that you broach, you go roaring away down a wave, screaming Geronimo, and everyone is having a wonderful time. At the bottom of the helm, at the bottom of the hill, the helmsman loses it, the boat rounds up, gets hit by the next wave, and before you know it, you're flat on your side. And it doesn't really matter what you're sailing, there's always a danger that that might happen. Especially if you haven't got a full racing crew and everybody's absolutely tuned up to the nines. So, we decided we'd heave to. No problem at all. We hove the boat to. She sat there, taking the waves about 45 degrees on the bow. The wind was coming from that direction as well. It's amazing when you heave to in a gale how quiet everything goes. You can't really believe it's happened. It's like turning a switch off. And so we sat there, hove to. The waves were big. It was in the Gulf Stream, so the sea was all over the place. It was a nasty situation. And we lashed the helm, went below, got out a bottle of whiskey, poured ourselves a tot, and we sat down to have a game of Scrabble at the saloon table. And that's how we sat out that gale. We obviously went to sleep after a while and went to our bunks. Somebody was always awake so that they could stick their head out every 5 minutes, make sure we weren't being run down and see what was going on, make sure that the sheets and everything were not chafing through. And that was it. And 36 hours later, we let draw the sails and carried on with our passage. It was rough and horrible, but we were on our way. We shook out a reef and away we went. On the horizon, we saw a liner, and it was the old Canberra. I thought I'll give her a call, see what she makes of all this. So I called her up on my VHF, which was the only radio I had. Pretty extreme range, but it was okay. And she came through. She could see us in the distance. And it turned out that the storm we'd just come through was Hurricane Klaus. And she had been riding it out in Bermuda. She didn't want to go to sea at all. She'd stayed safe in harbour. And she asked us what sort of time we'd had, because apparently there was another yacht fairly close to us, a big yacht, might have been a Swan, I'm not sure, and had rolled clean over and had been dismasted. And we had sat there, perfectly safe, hove to in this heavy displacement boat. Well, it makes you think, doesn't it? And I'll tell you how bad it was. When we got to Anguilla a week later, we sailed into the harbour, and there was ships lying on their sides and yachts all over the beach. It was a complete shambles. And this is what we'd come through, quite safely, hove to, under double reefed staysail and storm trysail. The boat had been fine. So, how does it work, this heaving to? I mean, what do you actually do to make it happen? And what sort of boats is it good for? And maybe what sort of boats is it not quite so good for? Let's have a think about it. The mechanics of heaving to. Let's think about it first in terms of a square rigged ship. going along with 3 masts, and each mast with sails on it, all drawing nicely, and the wind abeam. She decides she has to stop to take a pilot on board because nobody wants to jump over the rail when the boat's doing 12 knots. So she heaves to. And this is what she does. She swings the yards on the mainmast round so that they are setting aback. The sails are now filling the wrong way round. They're inside out effectively, and they're trying to drive the boat backwards. They fight against the other sails, and the bottom line is that the vessel doesn't know whether it's coming or going, and it stops. Brilliant. Well, something similar happens with a yacht, really, but there's a slight additional complication because yachts sail to windward a lot better than those old square riggers used to, and they have a central point which determines what's going to happen. And the central point under the water is called the central lateral resistance. It's the keel, basically, in a modern yacht, the keel that's sticking down on its own. It's a bit more difficult to define in a boat like my old pilot cutter. If you look at the shape of the boat here, you can see that well, it's sort of somewhere in the middle there, and that's all you need to know, really, because the point about it is that any sail set forward of that point will tend to drive the boat away from the wind, and any sail set abaft that point will tend to push the stern away and push her up into the wind. It's that simple, really. If the mainsail abaft the pivot point is driving the boat along, and the head sail forward of the pivot point, if you pull it to windward so that it's inside out, and is trying to sail the boat backwards, the boat will stop. And because of the disposition of the 2 sails, where they are in relation to the pivot point of the boat, she'll stop reasonably stably. The nature of things is that she'll actually try to bear away because the power of the backed head sail is very considerable. So to stop that happening, you steer hard to windward. You lash the wheel so that you're steering as hard to windward as you can, or if you've got a tiller, you shove it down to leeward and lash it down there. The boat is now trying to steer up towards the wind, and the head sail, which is aback, won't let her. So she forms an equilibrium. Now, how good that equilibrium is depends on the type of boat. At my old boat, they did it beautifully. They were designed to do it. They were designed to stop as well as go, and they did it wonderfully well. The old pilot boat that I described earlier on in the big storm, she would lie to with the wind about 40-45 degrees on the bow, as though she were close hauled, which was wonderful because it meant she was taking the seas on her shoulder, which is the best place to take the seas. Perfect. Absolutely what you want. With some modern yachts, especially the ones that have got very cutaway profile under the water, the only lateral resistance is really coming from the keel. There's nothing stopping us swivelling under the water. There's no inertia there. So the head sail will swivel her very hard to leeward. The big rudder will do a good job of stopping her, but unfortunately, because there's no essential lateral resistance forward of the keel of any sort, a wave will hit her and knock her straight off. The mainsail will then fill and she'll start sailing. And it's very difficult for a boat like that to heave to in a seaway. You might be able to heave to outside a harbour, perhaps to wait for daylight or wait for the tide to rise, or you could even heave to in the middle of a nice afternoon passage if it's a bit bouncy, so that somebody can go down and put the kettle on for a cup of tea, or so that, well, if you've got a big chap like me trying to get into the heads and the boat's bouncing about, it's not easy, is it? So just heave to. Give him half a chance so he can do what he's got to do like a gentleman. Works very well, but don't expect it to be wonderful in storm conditions. You can adjust the angle that the boat's lying to the wind by juggling the sheets and seeing what's working best. But it's always the same story. If you've got a long keel with plenty of grunt under the water forward of the pivot point, she'll heave to wonderfully. If you haven't, it might be a bit tricky. Anyway, now you understand the mechanics of it. That's it, really. The thing to do is get out there and try it. But just remember this, the wording is important. I heave to. What are we going to do now? Let's heave to. What did we do yesterday? Well, we sat outside the Needles with the boat hove to. Hove to in the past, heave to in the present. And I suppose in the future, what are we going to do tomorrow? Well, we'll heave to, won't we? So there you are. You heave the boat to, or the boat is hove to. Try and get that right, because it's embarrassing, really, if you get it wrong. Anyway, there we are. Heaving to. A great answer for a lot of people. And not many people do it anymore. So let's get stuck in and give it a go. You'll be amazed at how everything stops when you heave to. It's like turning off a light switch. Beautiful.